Good evening, everyone, and thanks for coming to our mid-December gathering. So, as many of you know, today will be my last talk here in Singapore for quite a while. As next month I'll be going to California. I'll be going to Berkeley, California, to the other side of the world to do a master's in theology at the Graduate Theological Union. And I guess since tonight is Christmas time, this is the time of the year where millions of people celebrate the birth of Jesus Christ. In our small group, I'd like to just take this opportunity just to share with you a little bit about my personal story and my Christian faith. So if I just start when I was pretty young, the story of how I knew about Jesus actually began with my father. My parents are Singaporean, and they're from a mix of free-thinking and Buddhist background. And so my grandparents are quite traditional Chinese, and they pray to Kuan Yin. And whenever I would visit them as a child, they would bring me in front of the ancestral worship shrines, and there were pictures of my great-grandparents there. They also like stone tablets and incense, and of course a few oranges and the pink steamed rice cakes. So they would hand me these burning joss sticks, and to hold these joss sticks and come pay my respects for them. And then I'll place the joss sticks in the sand right in front of the altar. However, when I was a few years old, my father suffered from an unknown and incurable disease. He was actually quite weak, and he was thin and gaunt, and he kept passing blood, and we just didn't know what was happening with him. So I remember as a child, he was lying in bed all day. He went to see the doctors in England. We were in England at the time, and the doctors there couldn't help him. They wanted to keep him in hospital, and they kept running tests on him. And the tests kept coming back inconclusive, and eventually he had enough of this, so he pulled out all the things, and he discharged himself, and he went to see the doctors here in Singapore at Mount Elizabeth. So after he saw some of the Mount E doctors, they couldn't find out what was wrong with him too. They couldn't cure him, and he was left bedbound and unable to work. And finally there was this one doctor in Mount Elizabeth who was also a Christian, and after many tests on my father, he said to him, I can't cure you, but there's someone who can. His name is Jesus. And now my father is never someone who just takes someone's word for something. He always wants to find out things for himself. But he did want to get better. And my uncle, my mother's brother, had just returned here back to Singapore after completing his studies in England. And while he was in England, he had become a Christian during his university days. And he recommended my family a church in England. So we all went back to England, and my father conducted his own research. He sat in bed, and he bought many books, and he read the Bible, and he attended the church that my uncle recommended. So gradually his knowledge and his faith grew, and then his strength slowly returned. But he knew that it was Jesus who had saved him. And eventually he made a full recovery from his mysterious illness. So my mother and father, they got baptized, and they started bringing us to Sunday school, where we learned about Jesus, God, and heaven. And growing up, I moved around quite a bit. I lived in different parts of England and Singapore. And as a result, my parents attended a few different Christian denominations, such as Methodist, Evangelical, and Presbyterian. And my parents wanted us to have a good education, so they sent us to a 500-year-old Church of England Anglican school, where I would attend chapel every morning. So we would sing hymns, and the hymns were taken from a big, thick red hymnal, and we would also recite the Lord's Prayer together. In my teenage years, I guess I was a pretty typical guy. I just want to be cool and hang out with a few other guys. And at church, I also took up to playing the guitar. But one thing that my parents didn't know, when they expected us to attend the teens' youth fellowship and join them in worship, I would go hang out with a few other guys, and we'd take out electric guitars and go down to the basement of the church center and start playing heavy metal like Metallica and Guns N' Roses. I don't know if you remember these bands. And we made such a nuisance of ourselves that the youth group leader had to come down from where they were having worship upstairs and go down to the basement, and he had asked us to stop playing so loudly because we were making such a racket. he didn't know what to do with us. We were all like rebellious teenagers. However, one day he hatched up a brilliant plan. He heard us playing guitar and he thought, hey, these guys are actually pretty good. So he asked us whether he would like to lead worship for the teens group one section. And he left the choice of songs up to us. So we thought about it. It's like, okay, how can it be? Maybe we just play our guitars during worship sessions. And so we chose a few songs. But then we thought, we just don't want to choose all Christian songs. It's just a bit boring. So we sneaked in one Guns N' Roses song in there throughout the worship session. But we tweaked the lyrics a little. So there's this Guns N' Roses song called Don't Cry. So the song goes, don't you cry tonight, I still love you, baby. So instead of that, we changed the lyrics to don't you cry tonight, God still loves you. So, I think we got away with it, and actually that was I enjoyed the experience, and that was kind of how the story I started serving in church and playing guitar on the worship team on my teens group. At home I also keep a prayer diary, and I'll pray for the salvation of my grandparents every day. And many years later, my prayer for their salvation was answered, and both of them eventually came to know Jesus and started attending their local church here in Singapore. Actually, one of the most amazing things about this is that my grandparents are both Hainanese, and the only Hainanese church in Singapore actually turned out to be just down the road for them. And they're in their 70s and 80s at the time, and they could even walk to church and listen to the Hainanese services and sing Hainanese songs. So it's really cute. I'll go and watch them, and there'll be like a bunch of... nobody really speaks Hainanese anymore, not often, and it's a dying dialect, like many of the Chinese dialects. So they were really like these 70, 80, 90-year-old people in the congregation. They'll be singing in a very cute way, and with the listening to the pastor preach Hainanese. So it was actually quite fulfilling to know in the last few years before they passed that they enjoyed and they got to know God and they got to worship Him in the local church. So when I was 16 years old, I knew for myself that I wanted to follow Jesus for the rest of my life. So I decided to get baptized that Easter. After I got baptized, I got to visit the United States for the first time. And my brother and I, we went there, we stayed with my auntie, and we attended an evangelical church in San Jose. And shortly after we arrived, my auntie, she sent us to go on a summer camp, deep into these redwood forests of Northern California. And these are the places you have kind of huge trees, like tens of meters wide. And this was the first time I traveled so far away from home without my parents. And it felt like a really mystical place, this redwood forest. And in this place, I had quite a few spiritual encounters. Most of all, I learned how God spoke through me through nature. And one day we were asked to go off in a quiet corner of the forest to meditate. And so I walked by myself. There's no one around. I'm trying to find a very quiet patch. So I go and sat down next to a stream that was running, and I just sat down to meditate. And I looked around me. I saw there was a spider spinning its web, and there were ants crawling up and down. It suddenly dawned on me the kind of intricacies there were in God's creatures and how He looked after them. And from then on, I kind of knew that He would look after me too. So at the end of the conference, I really had enjoyed California. I was there for about a month. I actually had plans to go back. I thought maybe perhaps I'll go back one day and study there. But little did I know it was 22 years later before I would be going back. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself in the story. So back home in London, the charismatic movement that had started with the Toronto Blessing in the 1990s had caught on. And my father, he was ignited and he was so enthusiastic about the charismatic movement. He brought us all to Pentecostal services that were held in different churches across London. So these were meetings that we often had to line up for over an hour just to get in and just to get a seat. And these were very long meetings. I mean, they lasted like 2 to 3 hours. And the conservative Chinese evangelical church that I was in also caught on to the charismatic movement. And one day I was at these sessions, and there were people being prayed for and being prayed to be filled with the Holy Spirit. And so there's a huge hole, and all the chairs had been put aside. And so anyone who wanted to receive this Holy Spirit would stand with their hands up, open in anticipation. So I was curious, and I wanted to receive the Holy Spirit. So I went up there and I opened my hands. Then one of the leaders came and put his hand on top of my head, and then he prayed for me. And suddenly I felt my feet started to shake. And my feet started to give way. And then I fell backwards, like straight back, and like a plank of wood. The good thing was, this was kind of expected, and there were people standing behind you ready to catch you. So there was someone who caught me, so I didn't just fall flat on the floor. But as I lay on the ground, I was there for around 15 to 20 minutes, and there was just no concept of time. So I saw myself surrounded by a white light, and it just felt like the perfect love of God. I was so happy, and it was pretty much the closest I've ever felt to being in heaven. So a couple of years after that, it was time for me to go off to university. So I went to Imperial College in London, and there I joined the Christian Union and the Christian Fellowship groups. And I enjoyed sharing my faith with other Christians and studying the Bible. I also attend conferences like once a year, and learn from Bible teachers and expositors and scholars at these events. And actually one of my best experiences there was in my undergraduate year. I was running the University Students Fellowship group for my church, and I really enjoyed running the meetings and structuring the meetings and kind of bringing students from all over different universities and countries together in one place. And then what was really fulfilling for me was kind of watching them grow and watching them grow in their faith. So I ran the student fellowship group for about a year, after which I graduated with a degree of mathematics and statistics. But however, by the time I graduated, I had about $50,000 in student loans. I initially wanted to do a master's in the States, but the timing wasn't right. I was in a relationship with my now wife, and my parents were experiencing financial difficulties. So, for me, it seemed the fastest way to clear my big student loan debt and help my parents would be to take a high-paying job. And where could I earn such amount of money, the greatest amount of money in the shortest amount of time? Well, I didn't need to look very far. There were plenty of Wall Street firms coming to every year to recruit on campus, and there were many talks and presentations that I got to attend. And as a student, there were all these freebies they were giving out. There were these mugs and stress balls and all these funny pens. So we just go and take them and listen to the talk and enjoy the free food. So these were the industries that were paying the highest salaries at the time, and I actually had no idea what these careers entailed. In fact, prior to attending these sessions, I had even no idea what an investment bank was. But these bankers, they came on campus and they certainly sold the lifestyle well to us. They promised us great things, from great training, exposure, a chance to see the world, and of course, there's a huge paycheck and a large signing bonus if you come with us. And all that sounded great and would go a long way to clearing my student loans. It's a competitive industry though, and getting foot in the door actually wasn't very easy. It took many rounds of interviews and multiple rejections. But at the end, I finally got an internship from just one of the 10 or 15 investment banks I applied to. And after my internship that summer, I got an offer to come back when I graduated. And so my initial plan was, I would work hard, take up the offer, get some good experience, and then after my experience in the corporate world, I would just, maybe take some time out after 2 or 3 years and do my MBA in the States. However, once I started work in an investment bank, I had to work 80 to 100 hours a week, and often on weekends. I was always on call, and it's not just the doctors on call, the kind of bankers were on call, and when my bosses needed me to be in the office, I had to go in, even on Sundays. If there's a deal closing that weekend or some presentation to do, I had to work throughout the weekend. And so spending so many hours in the office, my working life and my faith became quite separate for me, as I hadn't quite learned how to integrate the two yet. So on the one hand, I really wanted to serve God in church, but on the other, I didn't have any time or energy to do so. So I gradually reduced my activities, such as running the students group in the church and playing guitar on the worship team. The only thing I could do though was to, in a midweek lunchtime service, I could attend an old Anglican church in the city of London. And I was hoping to get some spiritual food there that would last me the rest of the week in a very harsh corporate environment. So just, who here has worked in or is currently working in the corporate environment? In a corporate environment? Not many of you. Okay, that's fine. But in the kind of working world, I think you understand what I mean. Then, is when I say that, once you've started life on this kind of treadmill, it's easier to say that I'm gonna quit it all one day and do something I love, than actually is to take that steps to quit. I mean, I don't know. It's nice having a very regular income every month, private healthcare, corporate gym, dinner allowances, taxis home when you work late at night, and of course, you have a healthy bonus that you're in, right? Well, in the mid-2000s, when I was working in the investment banking world, it's actually harder to quit than it is now. Firstly, the economy was doing so much better than it is today, and there were much, much more opportunities available to young, ambitious, hardworking graduates. China was also growing especially fast, and my boss was doing a lot of business there. As a result, I prayed for an opportunity to join him, which was eventually fulfilled when my boss, out of the blue, sent me to Hong Kong for a 2-month project. So when I heard this, I was overjoyed. I mean, this project opened the door to a more permanent move to Hong Kong. And I'd always wanted the chance of living in Asia and a chance to explore my Asian roots further and a chance to travel to see the world. And now they were offering me an expat package that was just too good to pass up. I mean, my take-home pay increased by over 50%, as Hong Kong has a lower tax rate than London, England. And I got a housing allowance on top of that too. And mind you, I was only 25 years old at the time. So of course, I jumped at the chance to see the world. My spiritual life took a new turn when I arrived in Hong Kong. I visited several churches, but somehow I was drawn to a smallish charismatic church there. I mean, the evangelical church I had attended in London had slowly phased out the charismatic movement, but here in this church, the gifts of the Spirit were openly taught. Things like from speaking in tongues to using gifts of prophecy, words of knowledge. I grew an understanding of the gifts that were used in the early church and talked about in the Bible in the book of Acts. However, work was still very busy, and I was covering 11 countries in Asia, and that meant I had to travel a lot. China was booming, and they needed someone who was more proficient in Chinese than my Chinese was. So my company sent me to study business China in Beijing for about a month. Now, the church in China was and still is undergoing great persecution. And so when I shared that I'm a Christian with the locals, their response was something along these lines. Oh, we don't have time for these Western philosophies. We're too busy working, making money and providing for our family. I was a little bit dejected by this, but one day, to my surprise, I found out that one of my teachers had recently accepted Jesus. And in China, the Christians, which are not part of the official churches, like the Three Self Church there, are forbidden from gathering in public places. And so much so, they met in secret locations, in other people's houses, and far away from government spies. So my teacher told me that actually some of the leaders in her house church had been arrested and imprisoned, and many of her members lived in fear. But they didn't stop them meeting together. her church just consisted of everyday Chinese people who were just struggling to get by. They weren't very affluent, they were just trying to make ends meet. And the more she told me about this, the more curious I got. I actually wanted to go and find out how they worship God under these conditions. And so one day I asked her whether I could visit her house church. Well, she was initially quite taken aback and quite apprehensive, but finally she agreed. Because foreigners are actually not allowed to attend these meetings, as the local people actually fear what happens if they were raided, and often houses would get raided by the local authorities and they would arrest the leaders. However, because I look local Chinese, yes, she allowed me to come. And so when that day, that Sunday when I entered their home, I saw like 20 people, huddled in a small room, maybe not too much larger than this one. And there was a thin line of chairs all crammed together. And so I took my seat in the corner of the room, and I watched as they sang worship songs, all without musical instruments. And the worship songs were written on like a white piece of card, and there was some sharing. It was just like breaking of bread, offertory, and a short message. Well, in my time there, what struck me about their faith was how pure and unadulterated it was. And they were just so sincere. These were people which have nothing and risk of persecution and imprisonment. And despite all their lack and all their poverty and all the risks of being arrested, they came together to meet and show me such love and hospitality. That was, that moment really stuck with me. So after my time in Beijing, I went back to Hong Kong, and armed with my basic knowledge of business Chinese, my career continued to progress. I switched companies to another American investment bank, for more responsibility, better title, and of course, higher salary. And where I lacked in having time to serve in church, I made up for by having lots of money. And I felt my role in the church had evolved somewhat. It had become one where I felt I could contribute financially to the needs of God's people. So I looked at the Bible and I saw there was one person which kind of had this kind of role in the time of Jesus. There's this man, Joseph of Arimathea, who was a rich man. And he, because of his wealth, he had a burial cave, and his burial cave was used to provide for Jesus. And so he was able to use his wealth and his possessions to kind of give and serve others. So I kind of saw my role evolving to some kind this Joseph of Arimathea person who was able to give from his abundance. So I faithfully tithe, that is, giving 10% of my salary to the church. And I sponsored mission schools and rice feeding projects in the Philippines. And these charities were helping people in destitute poverty, people who are struggling with basic survival. And I was also a big supporter of the African refugee ministry in the church, which consisted of people who had to flee Africa, leaving their whole families behind. So after a couple of years in Hong Kong in this kind of lifestyle, I got married. My wife is Catholic, and whereas I'd grown up in mainly Protestant denominations, it was a slightly different way of looking at how to worship in the worship services. As a result, it took quite a while to decide which church to get married in. Eventually, though, after months of discussion, we reached a compromise. We would get married in Brunei, where she's from, in the Catholic church. And the service would be done slightly differently, though. So what we managed to work out was that the bishop of the Catholic church would do the vows. And then my pastor, who would fly in from our evangelical church in England, would do the message, homily, and the blessing. And this type of style for a wedding was unprecedented at the time. And actually it turned out to be the first ecumenical wedding of its kind in Brunei. So ecumenical is kind of bringing the different denominations together. So after we got married, and what this style of marriage actually paved the way for other mixed Protestant and Catholic marriages to be conducted in a similar manner in Brunei. So after getting married, my career continued to progress at a rapid rate. The economy was still booming, and I was one of the top producers, making millions of dollars for my firm. I was staying in five-star hotels on business trips and holidays, and we ate at the best restaurants in the country. And life was pretty good. We had many friends, and we would throw lavish parties and in our big condo for them. But things don't always stay this way long. And a year later, the global financial crisis came, and that created a huge turmoil in my industry. And at the time, I was really worried that I would lose my job. And eventually, in the year 2010, I did. Where was I? 2010, yeah. So I lost my high-flying job in investment banking in 2010. And when that happened, things completely changed. In the first few months that I lost my job, I was actually quite relieved. I had been really stressed out for many years in the whole trading environment, and I felt I really needed a break. And at the time, I was getting really tired of the industry, and my back, my arms, and my shoulders were all starting to ache and be painful pretty badly. But this few months out between jobs, I had some time to try something new. So through my church in Hong Kong, I heard of a charity that catered to the homeless, drug addicts, and former gang members. So this place is known as St. Stephen's Society. And she is set up by a missionary called Jackie Pullinger, who came to Hong Kong on a long boat from England in the 1960s. And many, many years ago, my father had bought her memoir, and her memoir was called Chasing the Dragon, One Woman's Struggle Against the Darkness of Hong Kong's Drug Dens. And so that was how I first heard about her. And I had no idea she was still around, but there she was in Hong Kong, and she was doing the same thing that she was doing when she first arrived 40 years ago. And what she did was she worked in a part of Hong Kong called the Walled City. So who knows anything about the Walled City? No one. Okay, that's fine. So basically, this place in Hong Kong was called the Walled City. It was a place that was actually under China control. It was not under Hong Kong government rule. And it was called the Walled City because it was kind of like a dystopian apocalypse type of place. It was these mainly densely packed high-rise buildings, and there was power cables and cesspools and rats everywhere. And there was no light could enter these corridors because it was all so packed tightly together. Now today, this place no longer exists, but in the 1960s and 1980s, this was a melting pot of gambling, drugs, prostitution. It was run by violent gangs where no police actually dared to go in to venture. It was like a no man's land because it was just full of crime and drugs. So fast forward to the time when I was there, it evolved somewhat. And the worship service I went to in St. Stephen's was held in a school hall which could fit around 200 people. But when I went there, I was surrounded by people who I would best describe as not your usual Sunday worshippers. So I saw many men and women, and they were wearing like worn t-shirts, faded cutaway shorts and broken slippers. And many of them had like huge tattoos all the way up and down their arms and down their legs. But there they were, and they were bellowing out worship songs, and they were praising Jesus on the top of their lungs. And so I looked over to my left and right at these triads and ex-drug addicts, and I would see their faces, and they would be very tanned, and there was lots of scars on them from the battles they were in and the effects of all the drugs, decades of drug use. But I could see there was a real passion for God there, and they were just crying, and tears were streaming down their eyes. And this really touched me, and I was moved to volunteer to help out in this charity. So we did street ministry, and it was done the way Jesus sent out his disciples, 2 by 2. And we would approach homeless people on the streets, on the poor streets of Hong Kong, and we would talk to them and try to understand their needs. And if they were on drugs or alcohol, which many of them were, we would invite them to come for a weekly talk held by the society and give them more information on the rehab programs available to them. We also visit the houses of these drug addicts, and we pray for them. There's this one case, there was a single mother whose home I visited, and she lived in a small 60-foot room. It was maybe like less than half the size of this room. And she had barely enough room to fit her bed, and there were two young daughters that lived with her. So all their coloring and their homework was piled up. There was a small sink, and there was a cooker, and all these, like a couple of PowerPoint plugs that were well overloaded. It was like pretty dangerous and shocking conditions. And I just wish there was some way to help her. There was just so many of these people in these tiny one-room apartments in Hong Kong. I also volunteered for night duty at the drug rehab center. And at this night duty, we would monitor and pray for the drug addicts who had just come in off the streets. And most of them were still high, and they were required 24-hour supervision. And many of them were on hard drugs like heroin and cocaine. But this is a drugs rehab center that's like pretty much like no other drug rehab center that's around. Here, once these drug addicts would come in, they'll be given no medicine. Instead, they were just asked to pray for Jesus to release them from their suffering. And miraculously, many of them actually did come off drugs by praying in the Spirit. And they would see visions of Jesus coming to them to give them comfort in their time of need. But those who came in and they didn't ask for Jesus for help, they tended to suffer more greatly. So this unconventional method of helping drug addicts was put into place by Jackie Pullinger over the previous decades. And it had been actually so successful that the Hong Kong government had started to pay attention. And the Hong Kong government actually gave her a piece of land. And if you know Hong Kong, the prices of land is like tens or hundreds of millions of dollars, Hong Kong dollars at least. So they gave them a piece of land to build a drug rehab center. Because the drug problem in Hong Kong is actually very big. And the government centers, which relied on modern medicines, were actually not very effective. And once the drug addicts came in and they were released from the centers, most of them, once they went out on the streets, to just get re-addicted to drugs again. And then they would come back to the centers. So all this was costing the government a lot of money. So on the other hand, Jackie's way, which involved a more complete healing and transformation, meant that the lives of the drug addicts were permanently changed for the better. And then they could go on to become healthy and good-standing members of the local community in Hong Kong. So regardless that the fact she was employing spiritual methods in their transformation, the Hong Kong government was fully behind it because of the outcome, and it helped to rid Hong Kong of its drug problem. So after going there for a few months, I met a former drug addict who became my friend. His name was Ah Chong, and he was someone who had also come off drugs painlessly. And his story was that he was just called out on the name of Jesus, and where there's other people who have so much pain and suffering, he just came off it. And he was so transformed by his own experience that he eventually became a leader in St. Stephen's, and he went back out on the streets to help people who were suffering the same way that he'd suffered for so many decades. So we would go to the rehab center together at nights. And these night duties were like from 12 in the morning to 3 in the morning, because that's the time when a lot of the cry for drugs and the urge comes out, and they're in a lot of need at the time. And he would share with me how to pray for them and use the gifts of the Spirit in helping them. So I went on about 6 months after I lost my job, and I was doing this volunteer work. And slowly it dawned on me that actually my own life was not all that different from the drug addicts. And you may think it's quite bizarre because, if investment bank on one hand and you have a drug addict on the other. But I realized it dawned on me that their lives had been shaped by the suffering of their past. And my life was also shaped from the suffering of my past. And my addiction and my high was not to the manufactured chemicals like cocaine or heroin, but instead, mine was my channel for my suffering was into like hard work and achievements. And I thought to myself, actually, if I hadn't channeled my frustrations and anger into work, I could maybe have ended up, despairing if I didn't have a family unit in which to support me. Parents, a lot of them came from broken homes. Then I could have easily ended up addicted to drugs too, just that they had. So armed with this new knowledge of myself, looking at the rat race and all the money that it offered me, that kind of lifestyle had slowly lost its appeal to me. So at St. Stephen's Society, it's a pivotal point because my internal journey had started, and this journey was propelling me to seek for something new and completely different. Jackie Pullinger's ministry at St. Stephen's had always been outward and outward looking, and she would preach to us on Sunday mornings, and in her sermons she would keep telling us, "Don't stay here, go!" And what she meant by this was that once we or any of the former drug addicts were kind of equipped and trained and more healthy, we're meant to actually go out and to help others and not come in and sit comfortably in church and receive messages week after week. But where would I go? So after some discussion, my wife and I, we felt called to move to Brunei. The plan was that once I was there and settled, I could take a break and start a small business where I had the time and the space to figure out actually what I wanted to do with my life. Because I knew I couldn't go back to that kind of soulless lifestyle of investment bank where I could just lose my job just like that and everyone just worked hard and made more money and chasing more success in career, and seemed very meaningless to me. I couldn't see myself taking my boss's position and becoming like him, and making even more money, driving a better car, living in a bigger house, and that just didn't seem like a life I wanted anymore. So everything seemed perfectly planned. My wife could also use her diploma that she had gathered as a doctor in Hong Kong and could return to work in Brunei as a doctor. But as you well know, life doesn't always turn out the way you expect, and I had absolutely no idea what God had in store for me in Brunei. Actually, as it turned out, the next few years in Brunei would be the darkest period of my life. And though I didn't know it at the time, I suffered from an incurable medical condition called fibromyalgia. My whole body would be gripped in soreness, pain, and disability that prevented me from working. And during this time, I felt that I had somehow brought this all on myself. Maybe I had sinned against God, and He was punishing me for my sins. So I repented. I repented of everything I was aware of. I confessed every sin and forgave everyone who I felt had hurt me and betrayed me to the best of my ability. I left no stone unturned. I examined and re-examined my heart for any sin. And then I waited and waited and waited for my miracle to unfold. But I couldn't get better. So over time, I grew to understand that maybe my healing would be a gradual process. And I started to figure out maybe those who don't know God, like my father didn't, I realized that often their miracle is instantaneous. So they come to know God and they know the power of God in a real and personal way. Whereas for me, I felt God was more concerned with my character. And He wanted me to be made whole. And I'd grow up and slowly develop spiritual maturity and bear fruit. As a result, I started to see my fibromyalgia condition was God's chosen path for me. But I would just have to walk it, step by step, and eventually I'll get through the suffering. I saw myself like Job in the Bible, who went through a great trial through no fault of his own. God allowed him to be tested. He took away his wealth, his status, his friends, and his family to test him and to see what he was made of. Job even took a piece of broken pottery and he scraped himself in despair. And I felt I could identify with Job in this way. So I would sit down on the floor of my home and I'll pick up these wooden and knobbly massage tools and I would scrape and prod my muscles so hard. They were left scarred. I couldn't understand why my body was in so much pain. I just wanted it to go, and I kept scraping my pain, my hands and my legs, and I would poke them and scrape them until it was bleeding and marked, and there were wounds. I just wanted it to go, but it stayed. And the churches I was attending in Brunei, both charismatic and Catholic, had no answer to my pain. And despite receiving prayers for healing again and again, I was still not much better. I also started to identify with Joseph in the Bible. Joseph had to go through 7 years where the crops of Egypt yielded a bumper harvest. But those 7 years were immediately followed by 7 years of famine, where the earth was dry and no crops grew. I felt this was the case with me. I received a good career with abundant prosperity and large bonuses for those 7 years, and now I was entering my 7 years of famine. And it was because of the grace of God and the wealth He allowed me to create in my good years that now I had at the time I had enough to survive through my lean years. So all this while I was going through treatment in the hospital in Brunei, and over a period of 1.5 years, I went no less than 70 times to undergo these painful treatments in hospital. So they would try to remove these knots in my body. There were hundreds and thousands of them. But no matter how hard they would remove it, they would put needles in my body and up and down my spine and all the way down to the bone to remove them. After a while, they would keep growing and coming back. I almost gave up, and I was in my mid-30s, and at the time, and my body was in so much pain and unable to do anything. I felt my life was over. And though I refused to accept my life would be reduced to one of constant pain and disability, I just didn't know what else to do. I also felt that everyone had deserted me, all my friends, all my families, and they all didn't seem to understand. And so as this invisible disease, you can't see the suffering from the outside. And so I was abandoned physically and emotionally. And I became depressed. I was actually almost about to give up on my sessions at the hospital. But then my therapist discovered a new program in California, one that could perhaps help me get better. It was a relatively new way of trying to treat people with chronic pain. And at the last throw of the dice 5 years ago, December 2013, my wife and I went to California. Thankfully, this was the turning point of my life. And the training program I was on helped my body strengthen itself, and in doing so, it slowly started to unwind. And after my 1.5 weeks there, I came back with some much needed hope that one day, eventually, I would be free of my condition. I returned to California 2 more times over the next year, and each time my journey of self-discovery continued. And over the next 5 years, my healing moved from the physical, just the body and the muscles and the movement, to the emotional, where I went through a lot of therapy, counseling, coaching, and spiritual direction, and now finally to the spiritual. I realized that by turning inwards and analyzing my past and searching my heart and soul for answers, I grew in self-awareness, and I slowly got in touch with my feelings. I even accessed feelings that had been buried my entire life and I had no awareness of. So with each step deeper into my soul, I grew an understanding of my unique identity. I saw what it meant to be created in the image of God. And as I started to know myself better, I started to know my Creator better as well. So one of the added benefits of the self-discovery work I've been doing was that it benefited my health too. So my whole lifestyle started to shift. As my heart grew in wholeness, my body slowly softened, and the pain started to get better. I couldn't form a fist before, and I couldn't move a lot. So now I can kind of move and grip my hands. There used to be a lot of pain and numbness and tingling up my neck and shoulders. And 2 years ago, I felt finally well enough to start working full-time. And so I moved here to Singapore from Brunei and started a coaching business. And so this idea was that allow me to try and get back to working a full day, as well as manage my time better. Here in Singapore, I also started attending a large charismatic megachurch, New Creation Church. I started to receive Pastor Joseph Prince's message on the gospel of grace. I learned how to continue resting in God for my restoration. And each Sunday, his message of continued hope and grace gave me great encouragement in my own physical recovery. Now, I was still in pain daily, but I could do most things that normal people could do, and just with a lower level of intensity. So as time progressed, I started rebuilding my life here in Singapore. But I was low in confidence and self-esteem after not working so long. It really takes a toll on someone's just general self-worth, not being able to produce and do the things I used to do. And it was actually very hard for me to face people again. Bit by bit, things slowly improved. So it was about 6 months ago when I had a dream. I dreamt I was in a library, and in the middle of a room was a map, and that map was glowing. So as I walked over to the map, I saw that it was a map of America. It was just on the table, and it was bright. So my wife and her father, which were also in the dream, they walked over. And although I was feeling a bit scared, I started pointing to different states on the map and telling them I actually planned to study in America. My wife surprisingly nodded in support, and even more surprisingly was that her father also supported the idea. And then I woke up, and I was actually the happiest I've ever felt in my whole life. The only emotion that could rival this was when I went to Disneyland like many years ago. So I actually looked over at my wife when I woke up, and she was laughing in her sleep for some reason. I didn't know what to make of this dream, and I don't normally think about dreams that much. But later that same morning, I met a bunch of friends which I haven't seen for many years, and surprisingly, towards the end of our meal, the conversation turned to dreams. So there's this one guy who said, "Oh, does anyone know about dreams?" Because he said I had a dream and he didn't know how to interpret it. Then another girl was saying that her pastor had done a series on dreams, and there's some meaning there. So actually it was then when I first started to consider that perhaps there was a deeper meaning to my dream. I just didn't know what it was. A couple of weeks later, I went on silent retreat for a few days. And now silent retreats have been part of the Catholic tradition for hundreds of years. But I've been generally staying in a Protestant tradition for me. I've never been to one before. But at that point in time, there was a strong desire for me to seek God with all my heart and discern His will for my life. So I shared my dream with the spiritual director there. The spiritual director is kind of like a coach, a spiritual coach. And she was a nun, and she helped me unpack it. And I slowly learned that actually dreams were not that uncommon. They were actually messages from God, and they were used in biblical times and currently as a way that God communicated with us. And not only that, God was very close to me. And that was something very comforting for me to hear. But there's a lot of energy behind the dream and a yearning in my heart that had yet to be fulfilled. So the 3 days I was in the silent retreat, I stayed there overnight and had 10 dreams. I don't normally dream that much. So each time I'll wake up and write them. So at 4 in the morning, I'll wake up and write a dream. At 7 in the morning, I'll wake up and write another dream. Then if I afternoon nap, I have another dream, I'll wake up and write that dream down. Turned out there were a lot of dreams about water. And water represents a new start, a new beginning. So at the end of the silent retreat, my spiritual director arranged for me to meet a priest who ran missions for an ecumenical university in the US. So I spoke to this priest for about an hour about my research interests in psychology and theology. And then towards the end of meeting him, he said, I think you should study theology. And I was shocked. I mean, I never thought about studying theology before, and I didn't see myself becoming a pastor or priest one day. But the more I looked into it, the more it made sense. And then I finally looked at different theology schools. So out of the 20 to 30 schools that I looked at, only one of them seemed to fit very well. And that was the Jesuit School of Theology in California, which is part of Graduate Theological Uni, the ecumenical university. And somehow, when I was doing all my research, I was drawn to the life of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits. And I found his life had several parallels to my own. I mean, first of all, he was a successful soldier in the military, but he got injured in battle, and there was a cannonball, broke both of his legs. As a result, he nearly died, and he slowly recovered. But during his time of recovery, he encountered God and a new purpose in life, and he left his kind of rich upbringing, and he started the pilgrimage, which eventually led him to form the Society of Jesus. And, incidentally, the current Pope, Pope Francis, is the first Jesuit Pope in history. So St. Ignatius then devoted his life to helping others become better and more spiritual people through the use of the spiritual exercises he created. So you guys are probably wondering, what am I going to be doing in California next month? So, if you heard from my story this evening, I've personally encountered Jesus in many different churches, many different denominations, and through a lot of different styles of worship. So spiritually, I feel I've grown and changed a lot. And at the Graduate Theological Union, I plan to research Christian spirituality, and especially spiritual transformation from a more ecumenical perspective, which is kind of a more unifying view of looking at things. After all, Jesus' words and his prayers for his disciple was that they may be one, just as he and the Father are one. So I want to research how that oneness can be made possible, and for how all these apparently disparate denominations can be reunited together again in a full understanding of what it means, who God is. And I've been running these personality workshops for about a couple of years now, so I'm also interested in psychology and personality studies. And I hope to research how different types of personalities, as found in Myers-Briggs and the Enneagram, are drawn to different spiritual practices, and how these methods are used to worship God and access his love. After all, God is love, and God also lives inside of every one of us. But actually, having said all this, I don't, to be honest, know what the future holds for me. However, over the course of my life, I've experienced and seen the love and the power of God, and it's been very consistent. So I've kind of no doubt that whatever God has in store for me will be above and beyond anything that I could have hoped for or imagined. So finally, I want to close with this verse from Isaiah 40. And this is a verse that has given me great encouragement during all my trials, my pain, and my hardship experienced in the last 9 years. It goes, "The Creator of the ends of the earth neither faints nor is weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the weak, and to those who have no might, he increases strength. Even the youths shall faint and be weary, and the young men shall utterly fall. But those who wait on the Lord shall renew their strength. They will mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint." So, thank you everyone for listening to my story. And have a great Merry Christmas. So that concludes the second